Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we slip past the velvet curtains and into the most secretive room of Tudor England. You are standing in the half-light of Henry VIII's bedchamber, the air thick with the smell of beeswax candles and rushes that have just been changed on the floor. The walls are hung with rich tapestries of hunting scenes, but the real hunt tonight is for gossip, power, and survival. You are about to discover that bedtime in the Tudor court was not a private retreat but a dangerous theater of politics and ritual. You probably won't survive this unscathed, at least not with your dignity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from, so drop your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is how large the room feels, almost like a miniature hall rather than a cozy space. The royal bed is an enormous four-poster, its carved oak frame towering over you like a small fortress. Its canopy is thickly embroidered with the Tudor rose, alternating red and white petals glowing faintly in the firelight. You can almost hear the creak of the ropes beneath the mattress, as Henry himself shifts his considerable weight into a more comfortable position. Here, in the center of this room, is where state business, private quarrels, and whispered seductions collide. You stand back as gentlemen of the privy chamber move around quietly, tending to every detail. They are not just servants, they are power brokers, chosen companions of the king, who hold the keys, literally, to influence. The routine you are witnessing is called the going to bed ceremony, a nightly ritual that transforms a simple act into a court spectacle. Henry does not simply crawl into bed, he is undressed layer by layer in a choreography of loyalty. First go the jeweled chains and broadcloth doublet, then the hose, until the once fearsome monarch is reduced to a vulnerable figure in a nightshirt. You might smirk at the thought of Europe's most powerful man, standing there barefoot like a scolded child. But here is where you realize the real point. This ceremony is about showing trust. If you are in this room, you are either deeply favored or moments from ruin. The fire crackles, throwing shadows that leap across the wall, and you wonder how many secrets these stones have overheard. Imagine, for a moment, the heavy tension during Henry's early marriages. This is not just a bed for rest, it is the site of dynastic pressure, where the king's every sigh or shout could shape the fate of England. When Anne Boleyn first stepped into this room, it must have felt like standing on a tightrope above a pit. Producing a male heir was not just her duty, it was her survival. You feel the weight of expectation pressing on your own chest, as though the entire realm is peering over the edge of the bed curtain with you. Tonight the king seems in a mellow mood, his ruddy face softened by the glow. One of the gentlemen cracks a small joke, something about the French ambassador's ridiculous hat, and Henry lets out a belly laugh that echoes through the rafters. You notice that everyone in the room laughs exactly the right amount, not too little to seem sullen, not too much to upstage the king's mirth. It strikes you as absurd, this careful balancing act of humor. But that's court life. Even here, under candlelight, it's all theater. Mainstream history tells us that this bedchamber was at the heart of what was called the privy lodgings, a suite of rooms where only the most trusted courtiers could enter. Being invited this far in was like getting the king's private password. But here's a delightful and slightly ridiculous tidbit. Sometimes those allowed to attend the bedtime or rising ceremonies would bribe lesser servants for a chance to peek, hoping to catch the king in an off-guard moment, or overhear a slip of gossip. One courtier reportedly paid handsomely just to observe Henry snore, because even the sound of royal snoring could be a token of intimacy worth trading at court. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were meant to elevate the monarchy, turning the king's most ordinary actions into sacred theater, or whether they were a relic of medieval household management that simply refused to die. Whatever the case, you can feel how ritualistic it is tonight. Each movement is deliberate, almost hypnotic, designed to reassure everyone present that the king is well, that the night will end without incident, that tomorrow will bring another dawn of royal authority. You catch the smell of lavender in the air, probably from the linen sheets. The Tudors believed that certain herbs could protect against miasma, the so-called bad air they blamed for disease. A basket of dried rosemary and sage hangs near the hearth, a little medieval air freshener that feels quaint now but was taken very seriously then. As you watch, a servant sprinkles rose water on the rushes near the bed, the scent mixing with the smell of wood smoke, until the whole chamber feels like a perfumed shrine. Henry reclines, grunting slightly as he arranges himself. His legs, swollen from years of jousting injuries and ulcers, are carefully wrapped. You notice the gentleness with which the attendants move around him, like they are handling both a beloved pet and a dangerous predator. The atmosphere is strangely intimate, almost tender, but never relaxed. Even lying there, Henry radiates authority. If he opens his mouth and names someone for promotion or exile, the ripple will be felt across the entire kingdom by morning. Your gaze is drawn to the walls again. Tapestries depicting the labors of Hercules hang here, showing the mythic hero wrestling lions and carrying celestial spheres. It feels deliberate. Henry wants every visitor to be reminded that they are in the presence of a man who sees himself as a new Hercules, a king whose strength defines the realm. But lying here, in his nightshirt, with a cup of warm spiced wine on the bedside table, the image is almost comical. You can't help but think, Hercules never had to deal with drafty windows and gout at the same time. The servants retreat to the edge of the room, ready to respond if the king calls for anything in the night. You imagine yourself lying down on the floor nearby, the rushes rustling under your blanket, knowing you will sleep lightly because any sound from the bed might mean trouble. If Henry stirs in pain, if he shouts for a physician, if he dreams of treachery, you will be jolted awake. This is not just a room for sleeping, it is a room of constant vigilance. You begin to notice small details that tell their own story. The rosary hanging from a peg, a leftover symbol of the Catholic piety Henry once flaunted before breaking from Rome. The tiny coffer near the bed, rumored to hold personal letters, perhaps even love notes to Anne Boleyn or Jane Seymour. The carved initials H and A entwined on one of the bedposts, a romantic gesture that would later be hastily scraped away after Anne's downfall. Every object here feels loaded with memory, like the room itself is keeping score. Somewhere beyond the thick stone walls, the castle sleeps, but you remain awake, hyper-aware of how strange it feels to be here. You realize this is not just a royal bedroom, it is the beating heart of Tudor power, a place where policy, passion, and paranoia all share the same pillow. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the ghostly murmurs of long-dead courtiers, whispering advice, plotting revenge, or nervously praying for a peaceful night. The fire dies lower, and the last sound you hear is the soft, rhythmic breathing of the king. You lie there, staring into the dark canopy above, knowing that what you have just witnessed is both profoundly human and terrifyingly political. This is where the Tudor machine begins and ends each day, where the fate of England rests on the restless shoulders of one man. And tomorrow night, it will all happen again, same rituals, same tension, same theater. You wake the next morning to find that the chamber is still half lit, the tapestries holding in a heavy warmth from the fire that burned all night. Your first thought, surprisingly, is about those curtains surrounding the royal bed, thick, richly embroidered, and yet they never seem to close completely. It is no accident. At Henry's court, the bed was not just a place to sleep, but a stage, and the curtains, even when drawn, were rarely allowed to be fully shut. It was a kind of open-air theater, letting witnesses keep watch even when the most personal acts unfolded. Privacy, as you know it, simply did not exist in this world. You approach the bed and trace your fingers along the velvet fabric. The weight of it tells you these curtains could block light, sound, and prying eyes if only someone dared to close them. But the rule is clear. Keep them partly open, at least enough for attendants or a discreet observer to verify that the king is alive, well, and most importantly, behaving as a king should. You cannot help but think how unsettling this must have been for Henry's wives, knowing that even their wedding night might be observed, that a sliver of candlelight could reveal their silhouettes to half the court. This is not paranoia on your part, it is protocol. The medieval and early modern world ran on the assumption that a monarch's private life was public property. A king's marriage bed was the guarantee of dynastic continuity. It mattered to everyone whether the king was capable of consummation, whether the queen was fertile, whether an heir might soon be on the way. You glance again at the open curtains and feel a little shiver. This is surveillance. But dressed up in brocade and gold thread, you picture one of Henry's early mornings, perhaps during his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, when the couple was still young and hopeful. After their first night together, attendants would enter the room, check the bedclothes, and sometimes even the sheets, looking for signs that the union had been physically sealed. This sounds shocking to your modern ears, but to a Tudor courtier, it was simply due diligence. A queen who failed to produce evidence of consummation risked being sent away or having the marriage declared invalid. That sliver of curtain gap was like a legal witness standing guard all night. As you move about the room, you start to see why this open curtain practice was more than just ceremonial, it was a power play. For Henry, allowing others to see him in bed was proof of vitality. A king who could be seen rising early, attended by strong young gentlemen, projected an image of health and vigor, even when gout gnawed at his legs. One contemporary chronicler noted with awe how Henry could leap from bed and dress for the hunt at dawn. Whether or not that detail was exaggerated, it was certainly repeated to reinforce his reputation as a virile monarch. And here is a strange and almost comical anecdote. There were times when curious courtiers would angle themselves just so in the room to catch a glimpse of the king under his covers, so they could later brag about it. Having seen Henry sleep became a weird badge of status, as if they had witnessed the sunrise before anyone else. Imagine trading gossip over ale. Yes, I saw His Majesty's hand twitch last night. He must be dreaming of the French war. The idea that your own REM cycle could become a matter of state would make anyone a bit uneasy. The scholarly debate about whether these semi-open curtains were really enforced every night or only during formal occasions is ongoing. Some historians insist that daily life must have allowed Henry moments of privacy. Others argue that the culture of observation was relentless, a holdover from the medieval idea that a king was never off duty. Looking at the chamber now, you suspect that both might be true. Some nights perhaps were quiet and unobserved, but others would have been crowded, with half a dozen witnesses peering into the king's private sphere like cats watching a fishbowl. Your thoughts drift to Henry's later years, when his health was failing. The curtains then must have served a different purpose, not just to display the king's vitality but to reassure the court that he was still alive. Rumors of a monarch's death could spark rebellions, and so attendants were under orders to keep him visible, to let the world know that the Tudor line still sat firmly on the throne. Even as ulcers festered and fever racked his body, Henry had to be displayed like a reliquary. His suffering made part of the royal image. You imagine a night near the end of his reign, the king lying in bed, sweating through linen sheets, the curtains pulled open just enough for a courtier to slip in and check his pulse by candlelight. The fire pops, the smell of herbs thick in the air, and you stand there feeling like an intruder except that you are required to be here. To be absent would be suspicious. To turn your back would be dangerous. This is not just surveillance. It is an obligation. You notice something else about the bed itself. Its height. Tudor beds were massive, high enough that you nearly have to climb into them, and the steps leading up to the mattress make the whole act of getting in seem ceremonial. This is not a place where one collapses casually after a long day. No. Here you ascend into bed like you are mounting a throne, and the open curtains allow the court to bear witness to this elevation. The strangest part is how normalized it all becomes. After a few nights of this imagined vigil, you stop thinking of the curtains as a violation, and start thinking of them as a kind of safety net. They guarantee order. They promise that nothing happens in secret. If the king were to cry out, help would rush in. If a plotter tried to sneak in, witnesses would sound the alarm. But still, deep down, you feel the disquiet that comes from being watched even as you sleep. You turn your gaze to the tapestries again, seeing them now not just as decoration but as silent spectators. The hunting scenes, the charging stags, the snarling dogs, they all seem to stare back at you, reminding you that this is Henry's forest, and you are merely passing through. The curtains may never fully close, but the eyes on you are more than human. They are the eyes of the court, the kingdom, and history itself. You almost laugh at the absurdity of it all, how something as simple as a pair of curtains could become a political instrument. It reminds you of modern celebrity culture, where every detail of a public figure's life is analyzed, photographed, and judged. Henry's court had no cameras, but it had an army of eager observers, ready to report every sigh, every groan, every morning after smile. As the morning light filters into the room, you take one last look at the bed with its curtains half open, and wonder what it must have been like to live every night on display. For the courtiers, it was an honor. For Henry, perhaps a burden. And for you, standing here centuries later, it feels like peering into a world where the boundary between public and private was not just blurred but erased entirely. You stand in the chamber as the late morning light pours in, and the room feels oddly crowded, even when there are only a handful of attendants present. The truth of Henry's world settles on you. the king is never really alone. Not even when the candles are snuffed out and the heavy door is barred. You notice the narrow pallet bed set up near the walls. Simple wooden frames with thin mattresses. These are for the gentlemen of the privy chamber, the men who share Henry's space, not merely as servants but as constant companions. Imagine trying to fall asleep with half a dozen other people breathing quietly in the same room, some lying on mats, some standing watch, all ready to leap up at the slightest sound. In the Tudor mind, this was not strange, but necessary. The king's body was the body of the state, and it had to be guarded like a sacred relic. There were guards outside the chamber door, yes, but these men inside were there to protect him from the dangers that could arise even from his own restless thoughts, an attack of illness, a sudden nightmare, a fit of pain. You take a few slow steps, picturing the scene at midnight. The fire dying low, the room filled with the faint smell of tallow from the candles, the crackle of the hearth. A few of the gentlemen snore softly, boots placed neatly beside them. One man shifts, adjusting his position, so he can spring to his feet if Henry calls out. You find yourself holding your breath, as though making too much noise might wake the king. There is a strange intimacy to this arrangement. These men help Henry dress and undress, carry his chamber pot, even share in his most embarrassing moments. To be chosen for this duty was considered an honor. The gentlemen of the privy chamber wielded enormous influence because they had constant access to the king, access that ambitious courtiers envied and schemed to acquire. A whispered word during a sleepless night could shape a royal decision by morning. You recall reading about Sir Anthony Denny, one of Henry's most trusted attendants, who was said to have been the one to break the news to the king that his death was near. The fact that such intimate news came from a bedchamber companion rather than a counselor speaks volumes. These men were not just guards or servants. They were confidants, advisors, and sometimes co-conspirators. But there is an eerie side to this closeness. You imagine being Henry himself, lying in the grand bed, knowing that every cough, every groan, every half-dreamed murmur could be overheard. Privacy is a luxury he does not possess. The constant presence of others might be reassuring, but it might also be suffocating. The walls themselves seem to hum with the tension of being watched. One quirky detail you discover as you move about the chamber. The gentlemen often had to sleep with their swords near at hand, ready to defend the king in case of an attack. It was not unheard of for plots to be hatched to kill a king while he slept. The danger was real enough that sleeping beside him was seen as an act of loyalty, a willingness to risk one's own life. Yet this also meant that if one of them ever turned traitor, the king's death could come quietly and quickly. Historians still debate whether this constant proximity bred a sense of fraternity or of paranoia. Did Henry trust these men like brothers, or did he lie awake wondering which of them might be bribed to betray him? You picture him rolling over, glancing toward the dim outline of the closest attendant, trying to read loyalty in the man's silhouette. And then there is the problem of sound. The Tudor world was not silent, no double-glazed windows, no insulated walls. Outside, the castle might echo with barking dogs, the clatter of a night watchman's pike, the sound of the wind howling through narrow windows. Inside, the rustle of straw beds, the soft creak of leather boots, the cough of a sleeping gentleman, all of it would mix into a restless chorus. Henry's nights must have been filled with this low-level symphony of noise, and you suspect that insomnia was as much a part of his reign as crown-wearing. You take a closer look at one of the small pallets. The blanket is plain, the mattress thin. But to the man who sleeps here, it is a ticket to power. These are the people who might catch the king in an unguarded moment, perhaps while he muses aloud about politics or mutters complaints about a counselor. A clever gentleman might remember those words and repeat them later to gain favor. In that way, even sleep becomes a political transaction. It is almost funny to think that the most fearsome monarch of the 16th century, a man who had 2 queens executed, could not even scratch his nose at night without half a dozen witnesses knowing about it. The idea that you could wake up with your hair sticking up in every direction and have to face your entire staff immediately afterward feels like a nightmare all its own. But it also becomes clear to you that this arrangement reinforced Henry's image. The king was always present, always accessible, always seen. Even lying down, he was the sun around which everyone else revolved. If he sighed in pain, the whole court knew about it by morning. If he laughed late into the night, People whispered that the king was in good spirits and that fortune favored England once more. The fire pops again, and you realize just how much of Henry's life was lived under scrutiny, even in his most vulnerable hours. You glance once more at the grand bed, and the humble pallets beside it, and feel the weight of history pressing in. This was not just a bedroom, it was a nerve center of power, a stage where the drama of the Tudor dynasty played out night after night. In your mind's eye, you see the chamber darken once more, the men settle into place, the king roll onto his side. The night stretches long and heavy. You lie there too, just another witness to this endless vigil, knowing that in Henry's world, you never really sleep alone. You awaken on the second night with a realization that is as heavy as the oak beams above your head. When Henry VIII sleeps, everyone sleeps because he says so. The routine is not yours to decide, not even slightly. The Tudor court moved in rhythm with the king's moods and timetable, like a giant organism whose heartbeat quickened or slowed depending on what Henry wanted. Tonight you experience this firsthand, as the going to bed ceremony begins not when you feel tired, but when the king declares it time. You glance at the high windows and notice that the sky outside is still holding on to the last embers of sunset. In a modern world, this might feel like an early bedtime, but you quickly realize that the schedule could just as easily shift the other way. If Henry was in the mood for late-night music, dice games, or whispered strategy sessions, you might not even see your pallet until the moon had crossed the sky. The king's bedtime is the kingdom's bedtime. The ritual begins with a kind of choreography that is almost musical. A page announces softly that the king is ready to retire, and the few who are privileged to be present gather quickly. Henry moves with the help of attendants, his massive frame leaning on a shoulder or two, and you notice that even this simple walk across the room feels like an event. It is neither hurried nor casual. Everyone adjusts their pace to his. The room is quieter than a church as he lowers himself onto the bed. Once he is settled, the ceremonial undressing begins. You have seen it before, but tonight it feels even more symbolic. The removal of his outer garments is like peeling away the layers of kingship. Each piece is handed to a specific attendant, and those attendants are not random choices. The honor of receiving the king's doublet or hose is a mark of favor, a tiny promotion that can ripple out into future wealth or influence. You realize you are watching a nightly redistribution of royal trust. When Henry is down to his nightshirt, the chamberlain murmurs a prayer, and everyone present bows slightly. You find yourself bowing too, feeling the strangeness of honoring someone's bedtime like it is a holy moment. It is not just about sleep. It is about showing that the king's body, soon to be unconscious, is still sacred and guarded. There's something almost comical about how the entire household must wait for the king's nod before they can disperse to their own beds. Imagine if your boss today had the power to keep you awake until 2 in the morning just because he felt like playing cards, and then expected you to show up cheerful for breakfast the next day. One witty courtier reportedly joked that Henry's bed had more power than Parliament, since it could adjourn everyone at will. You learned that these routines could even be manipulated for political effect. If Henry wanted to reward someone, he might call them into the bedchamber for an intimate chat before sleeping. If he wanted to humiliate someone, he could keep them standing for hours until he decided to dismiss them. One story tells of a courtier who dared to yawn during the ceremony and found himself banished from the privy chamber for a month, a small act of boredom that turned into a career setback. A curious little detail catches your eye, a sandglass sitting on a side table. Its fine white grains pour silently from one bulb to another, and you realize it may have been used to time certain portions of the ritual. Not too fast, not too slow, everything has its place. You imagine Henry glancing at it, deciding whether to extend the evening's conversation or end it abruptly. Even time itself seems to obey his command. Scholars still discuss whether this strict control over nightly routine was primarily about security or about reinforcing royal mystique. Was Henry genuinely afraid of assassination and therefore kept everyone on edge? Or was he simply enjoying the performance of power, savoring the knowledge that dozens of lives bent and twisted around his personal schedule? Standing here in the dim light, you suspect it was both. Henry was a man who thrived on ceremony, and the bedroom was his last bastion of control at the end of each day. Your senses pick up every detail. The rustle of the sheets as the king shifts, the creak of the bed ropes, the faint aroma of beeswax and spiced wine lingering in the air. These are the sounds and smells that marked the official closing of the royal day. You find yourself oddly calmed by the predictability of it, as though watching the tide go in and out. Yet beneath that calm runs a current of unease. As you settle onto your pallet, you realize how unnatural it feels to surrender your own sleep schedule. If Henry wakes at dawn, you wake at dawn. If Henry rises late, you must hover nearby until he emerges. There is no such thing as a leisurely lie-in unless the king decides to have one. Even the gentle snoring you hear from one of the attendants is measured, careful not to disturb the monarch's rest. A quirky anecdote comes to mind from the reign of Francis I of France, a contemporary of Henry's. He was known to call his courtiers into his chamber at any hour, even waking them from sleep to discuss hunting plans. One can only imagine Henry doing something similar, ringing a bell in the dead of night to demand a reading of dispatches from Calais, or to call for music to soothe a restless mood. In the Tudor world, kings did not respect the idea of personal time. The servants of Notavizenstetend and my logs to him. The fire pops and sends a shower of sparks up the chimney, and you roll onto your side, aware that you are sharing this strange rhythm with an entire household. You wonder how many ambitious young men prayed for the chance to be summoned to this chamber, even if it meant giving up their own comfort. For them, a sleepless night near the king's bed was a small price to pay for proximity to power. It occurs to you that this nightly schedule must have had a profound effect on everyone's health. Lack of consistent sleep, endless waiting, the stress of constant alertness. No wonder the Tudor court was a breeding ground for illness and short tempers. And yet, there is an undeniable beauty to the ceremony, a sense of stepping outside ordinary time into a ritual space. You can see why some found it intoxicating. The candles are snuffed one by one, plunging the room into shadow, and silence descends except for the crackle of the dying fire. You lie awake a few minutes longer, reflecting on how bedtime here is not just about rest, but about reinforcing hierarchy, shaping relationships, and reminding everyone, yourself included, that this entire court orbits around one man's body and his decision to close his eyes. Somewhere deep in the castle, a bell tolls the late hour, and you finally let your own eyelids drift shut, knowing that when you open them again, it will not be because you are ready to wake, but because Henry commands it. When you rise the next morning, you realize with a faint smile that you now know exactly what Henry VIII wears to bed, and that it is no trivial fact. The king's nightshirt, which might sound like the least consequential garment in England, is in fact a symbol of politics, hierarchy, and courtly favor. Tonight, you witness its full meaning unfold before your eyes. The room is warm from a freshly stoked fire. Two attendants approach the bed with carefully folded linen, the nightshirt laid out as if it were a sacred relic. You notice at once that this is no plain cloth. It is soft, fine, and probably woven from the best Holland linen available. The edges are embroidered with a subtle but unmistakable design. The Tudor rose and the crowned initials H.R. for Henricus Rex. Even in sleepwear, the king cannot be mistaken for an ordinary man. You watch as the gentlemen of the bedchamber assist him in rising, and there is something ceremonious about the entire process. His nightshirt is changed daily, sometimes more often, and the privilege of handing it to the king is not given lightly. It is one of those subtle honors that signal who is in royal favor at the moment. A single gesture, you hand me the nightshirt, could elevate a courtier's standing overnight. The tension is palpable, as you imagine ambitious men angling for that small but potent recognition. You think back to the early days of Henry's reign, when he was young and athletic, and his nightshirt must have been a symbol of virility. This was the man who dazzled the court with his jousting and dancing, who was compared to Apollo for his beauty. To be the one to help him into his nightshirt was not merely to perform a task, it was to take part in a living image of royal vitality. A courtier could go home that night and say, "The king trusted me with his very body." There is an almost comic side to it too. Imagine if your own pajamas were treated like state regalia, your nightly outfit watched and admired by half a dozen onlookers. And yet, to Henry's world, the intimacy of clothing was power. Just as courtiers fought for the right to carry the king's sword or hold the basin for his hand-washing, so too did they vie for the chance to present his bedclothes. A curious tidbit that always makes historians chuckle is the report that some courtiers, having been granted the privilege of helping the king dress or undress, would keep the linen they handled as a token, sometimes even as a charm. One account claims that a gentleman treasured the towel he had used to dry the king's hands for years, regarding it as a badge of honor. You can only imagine someone keeping Henry's nightshirt in a chest, like a relic of a saint. But there is also a darker edge to this intimacy. As you watch Henry slip into his fresh nightshirt, you see the way the attendants glance at his legs, swollen with edema, at the stiffness in his gait. Every movement is a silent health report. These men are not just dressing the king, they are taking stock of his condition. Their observations might be whispered to other courtiers later, forming the basis for speculation about the king's ability to lead, fight, or father children. Historians still argue whether this constant surveillance contributed to Henry's notorious paranoia in his later years. Imagine being scrutinized every evening as you prepare to rest, knowing that any wince of pain could be reported to the wider court by morning. You would begin to see every servant's glance as a potential betrayal, every murmur as a judgment. The nightshirt, in this light, becomes not just a garment but a screen onto which the kingdom projects its hopes and fears. You notice that tonight's nightshirt smells faintly of lavender water, meant to soothe the king before sleep. The Tudors believed strongly in the medicinal properties of herbs, and lavender was thought to calm the spirit. As the fragrance fills the room, you feel the tension ease slightly, though the air still hums with the unspoken reality that this bedtime moment is also a public performance. The firelight catches on the embroidery, making the Tudor roses gleam. You find yourself thinking about how even this small detail reinforces royal propaganda. The king's body, wrapped in a garment emblazoned with his insignia, becomes a living emblem of dynastic continuity. It is as if the nightshirt is reminding everyone present, this is not just a man, but the very embodiment of England's future. A quirky thought crosses your mind: what if Henry ever had a favorite nightshirt, some lucky piece of linen he believed brought him good fortune? Superstition ran deep in the 16th century, and it would not have been unusual for him to favor a certain garment on the eve of an important council meeting or battle decision. You imagine a young page, quietly instructed to fetch the one with the gold stitching, as though it might tilt the balance of fate. Tonight, Henry seems in relatively good humor. He cracks a mild joke about the French, and a ripple of cautious laughter runs through the room. You realize that these moments, trivial though they seem, could shift the tone of the entire court the next day. If the king went to bed cheerful, everyone breathed easier. If he went to bed sullen, rumor spread like wildfire by sunrise. You cannot help but think about how strange it is to treat bedtime as a barometer of national stability, and yet that is exactly what was happening here. The nightshirt is not just cotton and thread, it is a message. Its condition, its presentation, and the demeanor of those involved all communicate something about the state of the monarchy. As Henry finally settles under the covers, the attendants step back. The nightshirt ceremony is over, but its political ripples have only just begun. Somewhere outside this chamber, courtiers are already whispering about who was chosen to hand the garment tonight, about whether the king seemed sprightly or weary, about what tomorrow might bring. You lie down on your pallet once again, aware that this nightly ritual will repeat over and over, a drumbeat of power that never lets anyone forget where authority resides. The nightshirt may seem like a small thing, but in the world of Henry VIII, small things have enormous consequences. The last candle gutters out, and the room falls into darkness. You close your eyes with the faint scent of lavender still in your nose, and the image of the embroidered Tudor rose floating in your mind, realizing that even here, at the threshold of sleep, you are still in the presence of royal propaganda. The next evening, you find yourself surprised by an entirely new ritual, one that seems almost out of place in a modern mind, but was perfectly ordinary in Henry VIII's world. Food served in the bedchamber. The aroma greets you before you even step inside, warm, heavy, and spiced, a mixture of roasted meat, clove-studded wine, and fresh bread. The bed is still there in the center of the room, looming like a throne, but now the chamber has been transformed into a dining space. A small folding table has been set up just a few feet from the royal mattress, and upon it sits an impressive display of dishes. You watch as servants bring in trays, bearing trenchers, goblets, and pitchers. Each item is carefully covered with cloths to guard against tampering. This is no casual snack. This is an event as carefully orchestrated as the bedtime ceremony itself. The gentlemen of the pantry and the cellar present the king's meal with an almost military precision, bowing and stepping back, their every movement measured. Even the act of uncovering a dish becomes a small theatrical flourish. The very idea of eating in the same room where you sleep might seem strange to you. But to the Tudor mind, the bedchamber was not simply a place of rest. It was the king's most secure and private zone, and therefore the safest place to dine. You are reminded of the danger of poisoning, a constant fear in courts across Europe. Here, the king can see who is present, who handles his food, and who tastes it before it reaches him. Yes, there is a designated taster, a man whose job it is to sample each dish to ensure it is not laced with poison. You find yourself watching him carefully, as he lifts a spoon to his mouth, waits a moment, and nods. The whole room seems to breathe easier once the ritual is complete. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. Henry's meals were famously lavish, sometimes consisting of several courses even when he was dining privately. Accounts from the court kitchens describe vast quantities of venison, beef, and swan being prepared each week, washed down with ale, wine, or spiced hippocras. To see it all laid out so close to the royal bed makes you think about how the act of eating here was another layer of spectacle, an edible demonstration of wealth and power. You take in the sight. Golden trenchers piled with roasted fowl, pies with ornate pastry lids, bowls of pottage still steaming, and sweetmeats glistening with honey. The firelight makes everything look richer, almost theatrical. And yet, there is something slightly unsettling about this banquet being held in the same space where the king will soon undress and lie down to sleep. The air feels heavy, close, as though the room itself is absorbing the scents. There's a quirky tidbit that makes you smile. Some sources suggest that the king occasionally shared morsels from his table with favored courtiers, an act that could make or break reputations. To be offered a bite of the king's roasted pheasant, or a sip from his goblet was a signal of supreme favor. One contemporary described how a single slice of the king's bread, handed to a courtier, could be interpreted as a promise of future patronage. You picture the eager faces of those standing nearby, hoping for a gesture that might change their fortunes. But dining in the bedchamber was not always a convivial affair. You can imagine nights when the atmosphere was tense, when Henry brooded silently, tearing into a hunk of meat while courtiers stood in uneasy silence. The clink of knives and the crackle of the fire might be the only sounds. Everyone would be alert for a single word, a single glance, that might indicate the king's mood. If Henry was displeased, the entire court might feel the chill. Historians still debate whether this practice of dining in the bedchamber was more about security or intimacy. Was Henry simply trying to protect himself from potential assassins? Or did he genuinely enjoy surrounding himself with his closest attendants in these moments? Some scholars argue that he used these suppers as a form of counsel, discussing matters of state in an informal setting where he could see people's reactions up close. As the meal continues, you watch the ritual of hand-washing, yet another ceremonial act. A basin of warm water and a linen towel are brought forward, and the king washes his hands before and after eating. The towel is then presented to him with a bow, and he wipes his fingers delicately. You notice that those near him watch this act with quiet reverence, as though it too carries meaning. You cannot help but be fascinated by how every detail in this room is layered with significance. Even the choice of food might send a message. A dish of venison could signal that the king had been hunting that day. A pie filled with expensive spices could be a display of England's trade connections. A particularly rich dessert might celebrate a victory or treaty. The bedchamber becomes not just a dining space, but a miniature stage, where political messages are served up alongside the courses. At one point, a musician slips quietly into the corner and begins to play a soft air on the lute. The sound is gentle, meant not to disturb but to soothe. You realize that dining here is also meant to prepare the king for rest, to ease him into the transition from public life to private sleep. The lute's notes mingle with the smell of roasted meat and wine, creating a strangely hypnotic atmosphere. You think about what it must have been like for Henry's wives to dine here. Perhaps Anne Boleyn, sharp-tongued and quick-witted, used these moments to charm the king, to whisper plans, to plead her case. Perhaps Jane Seymour, more reserved, sat quietly and prayed she would not say anything to ruffle Henry's temper. The bed just a few feet away would have been a constant reminder of the pressures awaiting them, the demand for heirs, the fear of failure. By the time the meal is cleared away, the chamber feels transformed once again. The table is removed, the rushes swept, and the air freshened with herbs. The king's bed is smoothed and readied, as though the room is shrugging off the dining hour and returning to its primary function. You watch this transformation with fascination, realizing that the entire space is as fluid as Henry's moods, now a council chamber, now a dining hall, now a place of sleep. There is one last quirky anecdote before the night ends. A chronicler once noted that Henry sometimes fed his favorite dogs in the bedchamber, tossing them bones while courtiers looked on. The image makes you grin. It is a rare glimpse of the king as simply a man, doting on his pets, perhaps laughing as they scrabbled for scraps. And yet, even this had meaning. To be allowed into the king's most private sphere, to witness him at ease with his animals, was a privilege. As the room finally quiets, you find yourself lying down again, the sense of food still lingering in the air. You close your eyes, thinking about how strange it is to combine feasting and sleeping in the same room. And yet, you understand why it mattered. In this world, nothing is merely practical. Everything is a performance, even supper. The fire burns lower, the last dish has been carried away, and you drift into sleep with the sound of the king's slow, steady breathing filling the chamber. Somewhere in the castle, the kitchens are already preparing for tomorrow's feast. And you know you will witness it all again. Another night of ritual, another dance of power played out just steps away from the royal bed. Tonight, the air in the bedchamber feels different, sterile, tense and heavy, with the smell of herbs and vinegar. You soon discover why. This evening's ritual is not just about ceremony or comfort, but about health. Before Henry VIII can drift into sleep, a small army of physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries arrives to perform their nightly observations. You can almost taste the anxiety that accompanies them. The first sign of what is to come is the appearance of a covered chamber pot being carried out discreetly. It dawns on you that someone has already inspected its contents. In the Tudor court, urine was not a private matter, but a diagnostic tool. Physicians would examine its color, smell, and even taste, yes, taste, to determine the king's state of health. You shudder at the thought, but for Henry's doctors this was serious business. The monarch's well-being was the kingdom's well-being, and every drop of urine could hold clues about the future of England. You watch as the king sits near the fire, his broad face glistening with sweat, while his physicians confer in hushed Latin. They carry with them a small urinal glass, holding it up to the light, swirling its contents, peering at it like alchemists searching for gold. One gently taps the glass with his finger, as if the sound might tell him something about the king's digestion. You notice how everyone in the room waits silently for the verdict. If the physicians pronounce Henry to be in good health, everyone breathes a little easier. If they frown or whisper too long, rumor will spread by morning that the king's end is near. Mainstream accounts confirm that Henry's health was a matter of national obsession. Chroniclers dutifully recorded when he caught a cold or suffered from a leg ulcer. After his jousting accident in 1536, which left him with chronic pain and ulcers that never fully healed, nightly inspections became even more crucial. The king's attendants would change his bandages, clean the wounds, and apply ointments of honey, herbs, and sometimes even goose grease to draw out infection. Tonight, you witness this procedure firsthand. Henry grimaces as two men carefully unwrap the soiled bandages from his leg. The smell hits you sharp and metallic, mingled with vinegar and sweat. You see the raw, angry flesh underneath and understand why the room is so quiet. This is not just medical care, it is a moment of vulnerability. The king's body is on display, and his attendants are reminded that he is as mortal as any man. One quirky detail strikes you as almost absurd. After the wound is cleaned, a servant throws the used bandages into the fire. You watch them curl and blacken, and you realize this is partly for hygiene but partly for security. No one must steal the king's bodily fluids for sorcery or curses. Yes, this was a genuine fear. Witchcraft was a real concern in the Tudor mind, and possession of royal hair, nail clippings, or bandages could be seen as dangerously subversive. The physicians then take Henry's pulse. You notice that one of them counts silently under his breath, while another writes on a wax tablet, noting the rate and quality. They check his tongue, they peer into his eyes, they even feel the heat of his skin. You find yourself marveling at how much medical practice in the 16th century relied on careful observation rather than intervention. They are looking for signs that might confirm which of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or black bile, is out of balance. Historians still debate how effective these nightly inspections were. Some argue that the constant poking and prodding may have worsened Henry's paranoia and irritability. Others suggest that this vigilance prolonged his life, allowing him to continue ruling for nearly 4 decades despite serious health problems. Standing in the chamber tonight, you suspect that both are true. You see the flash of irritation in Henry's eyes as the surgeon presses too hard on his leg, but you also see the relief on his face when the pain subsides after the fresh bandages are applied. A basin of warm water is brought forward, and the king's feet are washed before he lies down. You are struck by how much of this routine resembles a religious ritual. The washing, the anointing, the careful preparation of the body. It is as though Henry is being consecrated for sleep, his body readied as if for battle with the night. There's even a small medicinal drink offered, a draught of spiced wine or perhaps a cordial made with herbs like chamomile and valerian to soothe the nerves. The cup is tasted first by a servant, then presented to the king with a bow. Henry drinks deeply, and for a moment the lines of pain on his face soften. You cannot help but be fascinated by how every stage of this process is both practical and symbolic. The physicians are doing real medical work, cleaning wounds, checking pulse, but they are also performing reassurance. Everyone present must be reminded that the king is still strong enough to rule, that he will wake in the morning, ready to govern. A curious anecdote comes to mind. There was once a debate about whether Henry should be bled to balance his humors, a common treatment at the time. Some doctors argued it would help relieve his headaches and swelling, others feared it would weaken him fatally. Imagine standing here, as you are now, and hearing such a debate while the king glowers in pain. The fate of England might depend on whether a few ounces of royal blood were spilled into a bowl. You notice that the fire has been fed with fragrant herbs, sage, rosemary, and perhaps juniper to cleanse the air. The smell is sharp and invigorating, a reminder that people in this era feared miasmas, or bad air, as a cause of disease. By purifying the air around the king, they believed they were guarding him from invisible threats. Once the medical checks are finished, Henry is helped into bed, and you sense the entire room relax. The most vulnerable moment of the day has passed. The physicians bow and depart, leaving behind the faint clatter of their instruments and the lingering smell of vinegar. You lie on your pallet, processing what you have just seen. To your modern eyes, it feels invasive, even dehumanizing. But to the Tudor court it was simply part of the royal routine. The king's body was the kingdom's business, and everyone had a stake in its maintenance. The candles are dimmed, and the chamber falls silent except for the steady breathing of the king. You think about how strange it must have been to live with the knowledge that every night your health was a matter of state, your urine a public document, your wounds a subject of whispered debate. As sleep creeps over you, you realize that you are not just witnessing medical care, you are witnessing a nightly act of reassurance for an entire nation. The king is alive, tended, and bandaged. The monarchy will wake again with him. The next evening, when you return to Henry's bedchamber, the mood is different again, restless, almost electric. You quickly understand why. Tonight the king is in a talkative mood, and the room hums with the sound of his voice echoing off the stone walls. This chamber, for all its solemn rituals and ceremonies, could be noisy well into the night when Henry chose to hold court from under his canopy of state, his bed. You take a seat on a low bench against the wall and watch as the king, already in his nightshirt, lounges against embroidered pillows. His face glows in the firelight, his hair slightly damp from the evening wash. Around him stand a few favored courtiers, trying to look relaxed but clearly attuned to every word that falls from his lips. Henry talks about the day's hunt, about rumors from the continent, about a new lute song he wants someone to perform tomorrow. The room is warm, crowded, alive. You notice something immediately. Although the king is noisy, the servants are completely silent. The gentlemen of the bedchamber, the ushers, the pages, all of them stand at attention, barely shifting their weight, ready to act if called upon but never daring to interrupt. Even their breathing seems quiet. The only sounds besides Henry's booming voice are the crackling fire, the faint rustle of linen as the king shifts, and the occasional jingle of spurs from a courtier. It occurs to you how hard it must have been to maintain that level of quiet for hours. Imagine standing perfectly still while the king lectures or jokes, fighting off yawns, your legs aching, the heat from the fire prickling your skin. Yet this is the rule of the room. When Henry speaks, silence must fall everywhere else. There is an almost theatrical quality to these noisy nights. Henry might suddenly demand a book to be read aloud, perhaps from the Bible, perhaps from a new treatise on theology. You picture one of the gentlemen stepping forward, kneeling with the book, and reading in a clear voice while everyone else stands like statues. In this way, even bedtime becomes a kind of schoolroom, with Henry as both teacher and audience. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. Henry was a lover of music and conversation late into the evening. Records from the time note that he often kept musicians nearby, and sometimes had madrigals or motets performed as he prepared for sleep. There are even accounts of him joining in with singing, his deep voice booming so loudly that servants in adjoining rooms could hear it. But there is a quirky detail that makes you grin. One chronicler reported that Henry's snoring could be heard through the thick wooden doors, loud enough to wake those in the privy chamber. His attendants had to learn to sleep through the royal thunder or risk going half mad from exhaustion. You imagine the muffled chuckles that must have passed between servants when the king's snores reached almost musical volume, though no one would dare laugh aloud where he could hear them. Historians still debate whether these late-night conversations were moments of genuine relaxation for Henry, or carefully staged opportunities to measure loyalty. Was he sharing his thoughts openly? Or was he testing those around him, looking for reactions, gauging who might agree too quickly or disagree too boldly? Tonight, as you watch his eyes sweep the room, you suspect the latter. There is something almost predatory about the way he studies his courtiers, noting every shift of expression. Eventually, the room grows quiet again. Henry's words trail off, and he seems to drift into thought. You notice how everyone else waits, no one dares to speak first. Even the crackle of the fire feels too loud now, as though the flames themselves are violating the king's silence. The attendants are masters of stillness, their faces calm, their eyes lowered, their hands folded just so. It is an eerie kind of silence, the sort that makes you hyper-aware of every sound your own body makes. You can hear the faint shuffle of your shoes on the rushes, the soft rush of your own breathing. You suddenly understand how exhausting it must have been to live in this constant state of readiness, always poised to leap into action if the king should call, always careful not to intrude with unnecessary noise. The tension grows until Henry finally clears his throat and calls for the all's well signal, a simple phrase or gesture that means the household may begin to prepare for full rest. The attendants move quickly but still without speaking, snuffing candles, adjusting the curtains, checking the locks on the doors. The room darkens until the fire is the only light, throwing great moving shadows across the walls. You lie down on your pallet, but sleep does not come immediately. You are thinking about how this mix of noise and silence must have shaped Henry's moods. Some nights, he would fall asleep exhilarated from conversation. Other nights sullen and brooding, and through it all, his servants stood by, silent witnesses to his thoughts, carrying them like messages out into the court the next morning. You imagine being one of those servants, memorizing every word Henry said tonight so you could repeat it accurately later if asked. A wrong word could mean disgrace. An accurate report might win favor. Even silence had political weight here. To remain quiet when Henry expected agreement could be seen as insolence. To speak too quickly could be seen as flattery. Every reaction was a test. A quirky little anecdote floats back to you. One French ambassador once complained that he could not get a straight answer from Henry during a daytime audience because the king had already made up his mind about the matter during an informal conversation in his bedchamber the night before. The real diplomacy, it seemed, happened after dark, when the servants were silent and the king was talkative. The fire burns lower, and the noises of the castle beyond the chamber fade to a distant hush. Even the dogs seem to sleep. You finally drift off, your last thought being how strange it is to spend every night surrounded by so much sound and yet so much silence. The bedchamber is never completely still, never completely private. Its noise and its quiet are just two sides of the same coin, both reminding you that you are in the presence of a king who controls every moment, every word, every breath of the night. When you return to the bedchamber tonight, you notice something you had not paid much attention to before: the locks. Heavy, iron-banded, and gleaming faintly in the firelight, they are not the sort of latches you would find on an ordinary room. The king's chamber is fortified, a fortress within a fortress, and every lock is both a safeguard and a symbol. Tonight you will come to understand how much these keys mattered and how dangerous they could be. At the appointed hour, the king's key is brought forward. It is not just a physical object but a badge of authority, worn by the gentleman usher of the privy chamber or the groom of the stool. You watch as he kneels, presenting the key to the chief gentleman in charge tonight, who will turn it in the massive lock with deliberate slowness. The sound of the bolt sliding home echoes in the room like a drum beat. The chamber is sealed. From this point onward, Only those with the right to be in the royal presence may come and go. Everyone else is excluded, sometimes physically kept out by guards with halberds. You imagine the line of lesser courtiers hovering beyond the door, hoping for a summons, straining to hear what might be happening inside. The key, in this sense, is more than a tool for security. It is a gatekeeper of influence. If you hold it, you control who has access to the king's ear. Mainstream historical accounts are clear. The gentlemen of the Privy Chamber were some of the most powerful men in England, precisely because they controlled that door. A nobleman could wait all day in the outer chambers, but if the groom of the stool did not open the way, he might never get to plead his case. Tonight you watch the way the key is passed from hand to hand, and you can feel the weight of it, almost as if it carries the fate of entire families. You remember hearing a story of Sir Henry Norris, one of Henry's closest companions, who had such free access to the king's chamber that he could walk in almost at will. It was this very intimacy that led to his downfall when he was accused, probably falsely, of committing adultery with Anne Boleyn. The same privilege that had elevated him also put him within reach of deadly suspicion. You glance at the key again and think how it can open more than doors. It can open the way to ruin. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. During especially tense periods, such as after a rebellion or a suspected plot, the locks were checked repeatedly through the night. One account tells of a nervous usher who woke Henry in the middle of the night to assure him that the bolts were still fast. You can almost hear Henry's irritated growl, telling the man to let him sleep. But you also sense the king's relief that his sanctuary remained secure. Historians still debate whether Henry's elaborate security was driven by genuine danger or by his growing paranoia as he aged. There were assassination attempts on monarchs in this period, poisoned gloves, daggers hidden in sleeves, and Henry was not a man to take chances. Yet, some scholars argue that the nightly locking of the bedchamber became more about ritual reassurance than real threat. Standing here tonight, you feel both possibilities pressing on you. The key is now hung on a special hook near the bed, where it will remain until morning. You can see it glinting in the firelight, a small but constant reminder that no one enters or leaves without the king's knowledge. It is strange to think that your entire world is now contained within these four walls, that the turning of a single key has sealed you in with Henry for the night. You notice that even the windows are barred, their shutters closed tight. The only escape, should danger come, would be through the very door that is now locked. The sense of claustrophobia grows on you, but so does a feeling of privilege. You are inside, on the right side of the lock. Those outside can only imagine what happens here. As the night deepens, the king grows restless. He asks for wine, then for a story to be told. One of the gentlemen steps forward and recounts a tale of a past battle. His voice low but steady. Henry listens, nodding, and eventually lets out a chuckle at a particularly bold anecdote. You watch the key glint in the firelight again, and realize that this little object has made this moment possible. The door is locked. The king is relaxed. The outside world is held at bay. You lie back on your pallet and stare at the heavy beams above you, thinking about how access and exclusion have always shaped power. The person who can open this door at dawn will be the first face Henry sees in the morning, and that person's influence will ripple through the court all day. The locks and keys are not merely iron. They are instruments of politics, tokens of trust, and weapons of suspicion. Another curious anecdote surfaces. During the reign of Edward VI, Henry's son, a scandal broke out when a courtier attempted to gain unauthorized access to the king's bedchamber by stealing a key. The discovery of the theft caused an uproar, and the culprit was imprisoned. The lesson was clear: even the attempt to cross this threshold without permission was treasonous. The fire crackles softly, and you feel the room grow warmer, almost too warm. The sense of enclosure is complete now. You think of the key hanging by the bed, so small and yet so powerful, and you understand why Henry guarded it so carefully. In a world filled with plots and shifting alliances, the one thing he could control absolutely was this door, this lock, this final barrier between himself and the chaos beyond. When the candles are extinguished and the chamber falls into darkness, you hear the faint clink of the key as it sways slightly on its hook. It is the last sound you hear before sleep. Takes you a quiet metal lullaby, reminding you that in Henry's world, trust is a door that can be locked as easily as it can be opened. Tonight, the bedchamber feels less like a place of rest and more like a council hall. The bed is still there, massive and commanding, but it is surrounded by chairs and stools hastily arranged for a gathering. You quickly understand that Henry VIII is not simply preparing to sleep, he is about to conduct business of state right here, with bare feet tucked under embroidered covers and his nightcap tied firmly in place. The royal bed has become the war room of England. You take a place near the back of the room, careful not to block the narrow path between the fire and the bed. The air smells of wax and damp wool. Several counselors have come in from the rain, cloaks still glistening. A table is brought forward and stacked with documents. Letters from ambassadors, maps of France, financial accounts detailing the cost of warships. You can almost hear the tension hum through the room as the king surveys them. It is a strange sight. Here is Henry, not on a throne but propped up against pillows. One large hand wrapped around a goblet of spiced wine, the other tracing lines on a campaign map. His hair is loose from its daytime style, falling about his face, but his eyes are sharp, alert. Around him stand some of the greatest men of the realm, Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Howard, maybe even Charles Brandon, all waiting for his word. The flicker of firelight casts them in dramatic relief, like actors frozen in a play. You recall a mainstream historical fact. Henry often conducted state business from his bed, especially as his health declined. Councils were summoned to his privy chamber, and sometimes decisions of war and peace were made while the king was in his nightshirt. To modern sensibilities, it might seem almost comical. Imagine running a country in your pajamas, but to Henry, this was perfectly natural. The king's body was the center of governance, and if that body was most comfortable under a quilt, so be it. The first matter tonight is urgent news from the continent. A messenger kneels, presenting a sealed packet. Henry breaks the seal with a grunt and scans the contents, his brows knitting. He asks for a map, and one is spread out across the bed itself, the fabric of the coverlet rumpling under the weight of the parchment. You lean forward and catch sight of the coastline of France. The king is discussing troop movements, his voice low but forceful. It is as though the bed has become a battlefield, the sheets the terrain of Europe. One quirky detail strikes you as both amusing and strangely poignant. Sometimes the king's dogs would be lying near the foot of the bed during these councils, gnawing on bones or thumping their tails while life and death decisions were made. You imagine the incongruous sound of a royal hound crunching a marrowbone just as the king decides to send thousands of soldiers across the channel. It is a reminder that, for all its gravity, this war room is still a bedroom. The conversation tonight grows heated. One counselor argues for caution, another for aggressive action. Henry listens, occasionally taking a sip from his goblet, before suddenly slamming it down on the table hard enough to make everyone flinch. His decision is made, and it is final. You can feel the ripple of unease and relief that follows unease because the decision means war, relief because uncertainty is finally over. Historians still debate whether Henry's penchant for holding council in his bedchamber made him more impulsive or more approachable. Some suggest that the intimacy of the setting allowed for franker discussion, free from the pomp of the great council chamber. Others argue that it blurred the lines between personal mood and state policy, allowing the king's aches, irritations, and nightly temper to influence matters of national consequence. Tonight, watching him glare at the map while rubbing his aching leg, you suspect the latter has some truth. A secretary is summoned to record the king's orders. He writes quickly by candlelight, his quill scratching against the parchment. The room is quiet, except for the fire's hiss and the occasional crack of a log. When he finishes, Henry takes the paper, reads it aloud, and nods. The document will be dispatched at first light, setting in motion a chain of events that will change lives far beyond these walls. It is astonishing to realize that the fate of entire towns may be sealed in a moment like this. With the king sitting barefoot and half reclined, you think of the soldiers who will march, the families who will wait for their return, the ships that will sail because of what was just said under this roof. The bedchamber, you realize, is not merely a private retreat. It is the cockpit of the realm. Once the decisions are made, the counselors bow and take their leave, filing out past the guards with grave expressions. You notice how some glance back toward the bed, as if trying to read the king's mood one last time. Was he satisfied? Angry? Did he seem to favor one advisor over another? These subtle impressions will shape court gossip by morning. When the room is quiet again, Henry exhales heavily and leans back against his pillows. For a moment, he looks not like a king, but like a weary man. who has carried the weight of the realm on his shoulders all day and all night. The firelight softens his features, and you sense that this chamber, for all its intrigue and tension, is also a place where Henry can let his guard down just a little, though never completely. A final quirky image lingers with you. A courtier once noted that Henry liked to keep a small table near the bed, piled with weapons, daggers, perhaps even a pistol, so that if danger struck, he could defend himself without rising. It is a striking thought. The same bed that serves as throne, council table, and altar of intimacy could, in an instant, become a fortress. You lie down on your pallet and stare at the rafters, listening to the quiet as the last servant snuffs the final candle. You realize that tonight you have not just seen a man prepare for sleep, you have seen a king rule from under his quilt, making decisions that will ripple across continents. Sleep will come late tonight, and when it does, it will settle over a chamber that has been the scene of strategy, tension, and perhaps history's turning point. You wake the next night to a chamber buzzing with an unusual tension, half excitement, half dread. Tonight, the room is being prepared, not just for Henry's sleep, but for one of the most peculiar and invasive customs of royal life, the public witnessing of marriage consummation. In the Tudor world, a royal wedding was not truly complete until it had been proved that the king and queen had lain together. And proof, unfortunately, meant witnesses. You watch as attendants bustle about, smoothing the sheets, stoking the fire, and arranging candles to cast just enough light for visibility, but not enough to rob the room of its semblance of intimacy. A stool is placed near the bed for a senior courtier, perhaps the Lord Chamberlain, whose duty is to observe the royal couple retiring together. You can almost feel the awkwardness in the air, a blend of solemnity and prurient curiosity. It seems unthinkable to you that something so private would be turned into a courtly event, but this was the norm. In fact, mainstream historical accounts confirm that royal weddings across Europe often ended with a public bedding ceremony. Guests might even escort the newlyweds to the bed, cheering and singing bawdy songs, before leaving a few key witnesses behind to verify that the marriage would likely produce heirs. In Henry's court, the practice was dressed in layers of ritual, blessings, prayers, even the sprinkling of holy water on the bed. You picture Henry on one of his wedding nights, perhaps with Catherine of Aragon, perhaps with Anne of Cleves sitting stiffly on the edge of the bed as courtiers hover uncomfortably nearby. The queen would be led in, her gown removed by her ladies, and then she would be guided into bed beside him. The witnesses might bow, whisper a blessing, and then quietly withdraw, though not always before observing enough to make a report. The door would be shut, and in the morning, the sheets might be inspected for evidence of consummation. A quirky tidbit that borders on absurdity comes to mind. During Henry's ill-fated marriage to Anne of Cleves, he claimed he could not bring himself to consummate the union, complaining of her appearance and citing a lack of stirring in his members. The bedding ceremony in that case must have been a source of both comedy and anxiety for the court, as it became clear that no amount of witnessing could force the king's body to cooperate. One diplomat even reported that Henry boasted about trying every night and failing, turning what should have been a private matter into public humiliation. The fire snaps loudly, and you feel the heat rise in your cheeks as you imagine what it must have been like for Henry's wives. For Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess raised with strict Catholic sensibilities, the idea of performing her duty under the watchful eye of witnesses must have been daunting. For Anne Boleyn, known for her boldness, perhaps it was an opportunity to show triumphantly that she was now queen in every sense of the word. You can practically hear the whispered jokes that must have flown among the gentlemen of the chamber afterward, even if they dared not voice them where the king could hear. Historians still debate how frequently these bedding ceremonies were actually witnessed to their conclusion, or whether they were sometimes purely symbolic. Some argue that the presence of witnesses was mostly ceremonial, and that they left after seeing the couple in bed together, not staying for anything more intimate. Others suggest that in cases where legitimacy might be questioned later, more thorough observation was required. Either way, the effect was the same. The private lives of monarchs were public property. You glance at the bed, imagining its heavy curtains drawn back, the king and queen framed like actors on a stage. The tapestries on the walls seem to watch, their hunting scenes frozen mid-chase, as though the very fabric of the room is part of the audience. You feel a shiver of sympathy for the queens who had to endure this ritual, knowing that their bodies were instruments of dynastic policy. The candles flicker, and you hear distant laughter from the outer rooms, perhaps courtiers celebrating the wedding feast, perhaps servants gossiping about what might happen tonight. You realize that the entire palace will be waiting for news by morning. If the betting is successful, there will be rejoicing. If not, there will be murmurs, doubts, and rumors that could shape the future of the marriage and the kingdom. One curious detail that makes you smile despite yourself. Sometimes, in more boisterous courts, friends of the couple would leap onto the bed after the newlyweds were tucked in, bouncing around to ensure they were well and truly pressed together. The thought of anyone doing that in Henry's chamber seems suicidal, but the tradition existed, a blend of fertility rite and drunken prank. As the night wears on, the room grows quieter. The final attendants withdraw, and the key is turned in the lock. You are left with the image of Henry and his new queen lying side by side, the bedchamber heavy with expectation. Somewhere in the shadows, the witnesses wait just long enough to be sure all is proper before slipping out. You lie down on your pallet, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how marriage in this world is never just about love. It is a contract, a treaty, a performance. The bedding ceremony is not merely about two people but about the entire realm watching, holding its breath for an heir. You close your eyes with the uneasy sense that, in Henry's court, even intimacy is a matter of statecraft, and that the sheets you sleep under might tomorrow become exhibits in the court of public opinion. The following night you sense something almost rebellious in the air, not because Henry is particularly angry or jovial, but because tonight you catch the faintest glimpse of something almost never allowed in the Tudor world: the desire for privacy. For a moment, as the king waves away a few attendants, the chamber grows strangely quiet, almost intimate. And then you realize just how dangerous this moment is. Privacy, for a monarch like Henry, was not merely rare, it was suspect. You watch as Henry shifts in his bed, the heavy curtains half drawn. He seems to want a few moments to himself, perhaps to think, perhaps to pray. But no sooner has he given this subtle signal than a murmur runs through the room. Two of the gentlemen exchange glances, uncertain whether to remain or retreat. The groom of the stool, who is never far from the king's side, hesitates. Should he leave? Is this command explicit? Or should he stay to ensure the king's safety? It dawns on you that alone time for a Tudor monarch was almost a contradiction in terms. To be left alone was to be unguarded, and to be unguarded was to invite risk, whether of attack, poisoning, or even political rumor. And yet, as you watch Henry's face lit by the glow of the fire, you see a man who might simply want the freedom to brood without an audience. Mainstream historical accounts show that monarchs of this era were seldom unobserved. Their waking, sleeping, eating, and praying were all witnessed. Even confession, though private in content, was a kind of public act. Courtiers knew when and with whom the king spoke, and rumors flew about the severity of his sins. The idea of a king retreating into absolute solitude would have made his courtiers deeply uneasy. What if he changed his mind about a policy without their input? What if he fell ill and no one was there to summon help? There's a quirky little tidbit you remember. At least one courtier wrote in a letter that Henry, during a hunting trip, once tried to ride off alone for a few minutes of peace only to be pursued by half the royal household, terrified that they might be accused of negligence if the king were injured. You imagine the absurdity of a sovereign cantering across a meadow, looking over his shoulder at a dozen panting attendants galloping after him. Privacy was not just discouraged, it was actively chased down. Tonight, you can feel the unease growing. The chamber is so quiet you can hear the crackle of every log, the faint whistle of wind outside the shuttered windows. Henry stares into the fire, lost in thought. Perhaps he is thinking of his marriages, of the queens he has lost through death, annulment, or the executioner's axe. Perhaps he is thinking of his children, of Edward's fragile health, of Mary and Elizabeth, and of what will happen to the Tudor line after he is gone. Historians still debate whether Henry's increasing need for control late in life was a response to these private fears, or whether his fears were created by the very lack of privacy that surrounded him. It is a chicken and egg problem. Did the court's constant presence make him paranoid, or did his paranoia demand constant presence? Tonight, watching him dismiss most of the attendants and then call them back again a few moments later, you suspect the answer is both. When the servants return, they move more quietly than ever, as though afraid to break whatever spell has fallen over the room. The bed curtains are pulled back wider now, letting more light in. You notice that Henry seems calmer, as if having courtiers nearby again gives him reassurance. Perhaps solitude was too heavy a weight after all. You lie back on your pallet and think about how revolutionary the modern idea of privacy really is. You can shut your bedroom door, draw your curtains, and be alone with your thoughts, but Henry never truly could. His body, his soul, his very dreams belonged to England. Even in this brief moment tonight, when the chamber fell silent and the attendants retreated, the privacy felt forbidden, as though you had glimpsed something you were never meant to see. The candles are snuffed, and you hear the click of the lock on the door. The king exhales audibly, almost a sigh. The room is sealed once more, and whatever thoughts crossed Henry's mind in those few private minutes will stay there. But you cannot help wondering if those thoughts will surface tomorrow, reshaping the lives of everyone in court. A decision about a marriage, a treaty, a friend, or an enemy may have been forged in that fragile space where Henry was finally, briefly, alone. Your own eyes close slowly, the image of the fire still dancing in your mind. Tonight you have learned that in the Tudor court, privacy is not a right but a risk, something dangerous, something that must be stolen in small, flickering moments. And when it is gone, everyone breathes easier, because the king is once again under watch, and the machinery of court life can grind on without fear of what he might do, unseen, in the dark. Tonight, the room feels watchful in a way that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. You realize that even among the trusted few allowed into the king's privy chamber, there are ears that do not belong solely to Henry. This is not just a bedroom, it is a nest of informants, each servant a potential courier of gossip, each attendant a quiet pair of eyes reporting to someone beyond these walls. You watch as one of the gentlemen of the bedchamber leans ever so slightly toward another, whispering something before quickly straightening his posture. The message is carried not by words alone but by expression, by glance, by silence. You feel a shiver. Every night in this room is an opportunity for intelligence gathering. Whatever Henry mutters in pain, whatever he confides after a cup of spiced wine, whatever name he curses in the dark, someone will carry it beyond this chamber before dawn. This is not speculation. Mainstream accounts tell us that Henry relied heavily on an invisible web of watchers and informants, many of them his own attendants, the groom of the stool, the men who helped him bathe and dress, and even the pages who fetched firewood all had the ability to sway the king's mood through carefully timed information. Their loyalty was prized and feared. A careless word from one of them could ruin a courtier's reputation or even cost a queen her crown. You think of Anne Boleyn's last days, when rumors of her supposed lovers swirled through the palace like smoke. Some of the testimony used against her came from those who had been close enough to the king's bedchamber to overhear late-night conversations. The very intimacy that gave these attendants power also made them dangerous. You glance at the polished floorboards and wonder how many secrets have seeped into the grain. How many plots were born or ended under this ceiling? A quirky tidbit drifts into your mind. There are reports that some ambitious courtiers would bribe low-ranking servants for scraps of gossip, sometimes literally scraps, like used napkins with the king's notes scrawled on them. Imagine someone hiding behind a tapestry, waiting for the servants to exit so they could rummage through discarded rushes for a clue to royal favor or anger. Even the ashes of burned letters were sometimes sifted through, in hopes of piecing together what had been written. Historians still argue whether Henry encouraged this atmosphere of surveillance or whether it developed naturally as a function of court life. Did he intentionally pit attendants against each other, knowing their rivalry would keep them loyal? Or was he simply the beneficiary of a culture where everyone wanted to report news to the king in exchange for reward? Watching the subtle exchanges tonight, you suspect Henry knew exactly what he was doing. His piercing gaze seems to miss nothing, as if he is gauging which man will be quickest to relay tonight's story in the corridors tomorrow. You catch the flicker of a smile on Henry's face as he calls one attendant closer and murmurs something into his ear. The man bows, then steps back, face neutral. But you know that by morning half the court will be buzzing with whatever news has just been set loose like a falcon from the royal hand. This is information warfare conducted from a feather bed. You imagine what it must have been like to be one of these bedchamber men, sleeping lightly, listening intently, memorizing words even in the haze between waking and dreaming. A single sentence overheard at midnight could be repeated to the Privy Council the next day, reshaping alliances or justifying a royal outburst. The bedchamber was not merely the king's sanctuary but his listening post, his intelligence network humming through the night. The fire crackles, throwing sparks up the chimney, And you wonder how many people have been undone by the secrets gathered here. You think of Thomas Cromwell, once Henry's right-hand man, who fell from favor and was executed. Was there a moment, perhaps in this very room, when someone whispered poison into the king's ear that tipped the balance? Was it here that Henry resolved to end his marriage to Anne of Cleves, or to sign the death warrants of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard? Another quirky anecdote emerges. One chronicler noted that certain attendants became known for their skill at interpreting the king's silences, as though even the way Henry stared at the fire could be reported as intelligence. You picture a servant standing at the edge of the bed, noting that the king rubbed his temple 3 times before sighing, then rushing out to tell an ally that Henry must be angry at the French ambassador. The thought is chilling. Every move, every gesture, every sigh is ammunition in the hands of those who know how to use it. The bedchamber is less a refuge and more a spy's paradise, and if there are spies among the attendants, you realize there might also be spies among the courtiers outside the locked door, waiting to question the men who emerge at dawn. Historians have described this system as intimacy, as currency, and you can see why. To be physically close to the king was to have access to his unguarded self, and access was everything. Even if the king never said a word to you, the fact that you had been present while he paced or prayed meant you could speak with authority about his mood. People might pay you just to know whether Henry smiled before bed. As the night wears on, Henry grows quiet, his head drooping slightly as he sinks deeper into the pillows. The servants remain at their posts, watchful, their silence filled with unspoken observations. You lie down, pulling your blanket over your shoulders, but you keep one eye half open, acutely aware that tonight's silence is pregnant with information that will walk out of this room at first light. When you finally close your eyes, the last thing you see is the faint glint of the king's signet ring as he turns in his sleep. The seal of his authority resting inches from the gossip network that hums around him. It is a reminder that even in slumber Henry rules, and that somewhere, someone is already preparing to turn tonight's bedchamber murmurs into tomorrow's political thunderclaps. Tonight, the bedchamber does not feel ceremonial at all. It feels like an infirmary. The moment you step inside, the heat hits you, heavy and close, as though the fire has been kept roaring too long. The smell is different too, sharper and medicinal. Vinegar, rosemary, sweat. A physician stands near the bed, wiping his hands, and you see Henry lying there pale and restless, his massive frame almost too big for the mattress. Tonight, you will see what happens when the king is not just the center of power but a patient whose body holds the entire kingdom hostage. The room is dimly lit, and you notice that several extra attendants are present, standing with tense faces. You recall that Henry's health was a constant preoccupation, and for good reason. His leg ulcers, his weight, his headaches, his fevers were matters of national consequence. A king who could not rise from bed, could not hunt, could not joust, could not lead his men to war, and might not even be able to sire more heirs. The bedchamber was where these fears became real. Tonight Henry is sweating profusely, his sheets damp. One servant removes them carefully and replaces them with fresh linen sprinkled with rosewater. You are struck by how intimate this moment feels, the king's vulnerability on display. His nightshirt clings to him, and you can see the pain in his face as he tries to shift his swollen legs. A mainstream historical fact comes to you. In 1528, the Tudor court was struck by an outbreak of the sweating sickness, a mysterious and often deadly epidemic. When the illness entered the royal household, Henry fled from place to place, terrified of infection, leaving courtiers and even close advisors behind. But tonight he cannot flee. If sickness is here, it is already in the room. The bedchamber becomes a battlefield, where doctors and attendants wage war with poultices, draughts, and fervent prayers. You watch as one physician prepares a concoction of herbs, willow bark for fever, sage for cleansing, a pinch of something pungent you cannot name. The mixture is poured into a goblet and offered to Henry, who swallows it with a grimace. His face flushes, and you see the sweat bead more heavily on his brow. The apothecary nods as though satisfied that the evil humors are being expelled. A quirky detail makes you smile despite the grim mood. Sometimes, to combat fever, attendants would hang bunches of onions or crushed garlic around the bed, believing the smell would ward off infection. You look around and indeed spot something strung by the window that looks suspiciously like a garland of herbs and bulbs. The room smells like a kitchen garden gone wild. Historians still argue over what exactly caused Henry's many ailments, Was it a series of untreated leg infections? Type 2 diabetes? The aftermath of his jousting accident? Or even something psychological, a creeping depression that worsened with each year? Whatever the cause, you can feel the weight of those debates tonight as you watch him toss and mutter. The king's pain is not just his own, it is the realm's. The chamber is eerily quiet, except for the fire and Henry's labored breathing. Every servant seems frozen, waiting for a sign of improvement. You realize that if the king were to die tonight, those present would be the first to know, and their lives would instantly change. Allegiances would shift, alliances would crumble or be reforged, and England's future would hang in the balance before dawn. One attendant wrings out a cloth and lays it across Henry's forehead. His breathing slows a little. The groom of the stool whispers something to the physician, who nods and signals that the room should be cooled. A window is opened, letting in a gust of cold air, and the fire is allowed to die down slightly. The chamber smells fresher, and you find yourself breathing easier too. You think of Catherine of Aragon kneeling in her own chamber decades earlier, praying for Henry's health during such crises, and of Anne Boleyn anxiously listening for news from the bedchamber when Henry fell ill. For these queens, the king's sickness was a direct threat to their security and their children's futures. A fever could mean not just personal tragedy, but a dynastic crisis. Another curious anecdote surfaces in your mind. During one particularly severe illness, Henry reportedly ordered that his confessor be kept nearby at all times, in case he needed to receive last rites. Imagine lying on your pallet at the edge of this very room, listening to the low murmur of Latin prayers, wondering whether you were witnessing the final hours of the king who defined an era. As the night wears on, Henry finally seems to drift into a more restful sleep. His color improves, and the physicians exchange relieved looks. You can almost feel the entire room exhale at once. A servant gently removes the herbal garlands and adjusts the curtains to let in a softer light from the moon. You lie back, exhausted by simply watching, and realize that this bedchamber has become a place where life and death hang in delicate balance. The walls have absorbed too many nights like this. Nights when the fate of England rested on whether one man's fever broke before morning. The fire has burned low, and the room feels calmer now. Henry's breathing is steady, his face relaxed. You close your eyes, knowing that tonight you have not just seen ritual or ceremony, you have witnessed fear, and the fragile victory of survival. And you suspect that by morning, this chamber will once again be a place of politics, gossip, and power, as though nothing had happened. But you will remember the smell of vinegar, the tense faces of the physicians, and the sound of the king's uneven breathing for a long time to come. You return to the bedchamber the next evening, expecting the usual ceremony. But the atmosphere is different, charged, uneasy, as though everyone in the room is standing just a little straighter. Tonight you learn that this space is not merely a sanctuary or a council chamber. It can also be a courtroom, and sometimes an execution ground, metaphorically speaking, if not literally. Henry sits upright in bed, already dressed in his nightshirt, but his face is grim, the firelight catching the deep lines on his brow. Several courtiers stand at the foot of the bed, heads bowed, waiting. The silence stretches until Henry suddenly speaks, his voice cold and deliberate. Someone, it seems, has displeased him. And in Henry's court, displeasure was not just a private matter, it was a public spectacle. Even here, at night, you watch as a trembling gentleman is brought forward. His offense may seem small to your modern ears, perhaps a mismanaged expense, a poorly timed remark, or a rumor he failed to quash, but in a world where proximity to the king is everything, even the smallest mistake can be fatal. Henry listens to the man's stammered explanation, then raises one massive hand. The room freezes. Mainstream historical accounts are filled with stories of Henry dismissing, banishing, or even condemning courtiers from his bed. Thomas Cromwell, his once all-powerful chief minister, reportedly fell from grace partly through Henry's nighttime ruminations. One night's bad temper could turn into a death warrant by morning. Tonight, you can see the fear on every attendant's face. They know that what happens in this room may reshape the entire court by sunrise. The accused man falls to his knees, begging for mercy. Henry's eyes narrow. You feel a shiver run through you as you realize this plea is not merely symbolic. The king could order his imprisonment on the spot. In some cases, a command shouted from this bedchamber would be carried out immediately. Guards summoned, doors locked. A man taken away before he even had a chance to rise from the rushes. There's a grim, almost darkly humorous tidbit about Henry's reign. He sometimes issued punishments so late at night that his ministers complained they had no time to prepare proper paperwork. Imagine being woken at 3 in the morning to draw up legal documents for a man's arrest, simply because the king couldn't sleep and had been stewing over an insult. Historians still debate whether these nighttime judgments were calculated acts of statecraft or impulsive bursts of temper. Some argue that Henry used the intimacy of the bedchamber to strip away ceremony, speaking more frankly and punishing more decisively. Others suggest that the late-night setting made him more volatile, more likely to act on sudden emotion. Tonight, seeing the way he leans forward, his face flushed with anger, you suspect both interpretations hold some truth. At last, Henry waves his hand in dismissal. The man is led away, pale and shaking, but still alive for now. You can hear the soft exhale of relief from those still standing. A single word from the king could have ended the man's life, and tonight, it did not. But the bedchamber has not finished its work. The king now turns to his attendants, delivering a curt lecture on loyalty and obedience. His voice is heavy, deliberate, each word landing like a hammer. You realize this is not just about punishing one man, it is about reminding everyone who holds the power here. The bed may be draped in silk, but it is still a throne, and this room can become a place of fear as easily as a place of comfort. A quirky anecdote flits through your mind. One ambassador once remarked that Henry's mood upon waking could decide the fortune of entire factions at court. If he rose cheerful, petitions were granted. If he rose angry, careers ended. The same was true at night. A single conversation before the king closed, his eyes could doom or save a man's prospects. As the attendants slowly withdraw, the room feels different, heavier, darker. The fire has burned low, and the bedchamber seems to hold onto the echo of Henry's voice, as though the very walls have been marked by the judgment rendered here tonight. You lie down on your pallet, your heart still beating fast. Sleep does not come easily. You keep thinking about the look on the accused man's face, the way Henry's hand froze him in place like a statue. You realize that this chamber is not just a space of ritual and intimacy, but a place where power is exercised in its most raw, immediate form. Eventually, the king settles back against his pillows, his anger apparently spent. The room relaxes slightly. Someone quietly stirs the fire, another draws the curtains more closely, and the night resumes its slow rhythm. But the memory of what just happened lingers, reminding everyone present that being summoned to this chamber is both the highest honor and the gravest danger a courtier can face. As you finally drift towards sleep, you think about how many lives have been upended within these four walls. The bedchamber is not just a private room, it is a crucible. A place where ambition can be forged into gold or burned to ash in the space of a single night. Tonight, as you step once more into Henry's chamber, you notice something striking. The bed itself seems to dominate the space more than usual. Its carved posts glint in the candlelight, its canopy heavy with embroidered roses and crowns. It feels less like a place to sleep and more like a seat of power, because that is exactly what it is. Tonight you will learn how Henry's bed functioned as an extension of his throne, a place where royal image-making never ceased. You watch as the king reclines against his pillows, but there is nothing relaxed about his posture. He sits tall, shoulders squared, his face lit dramatically by the fire. Attendants gather, and you realize that you are witnessing not bedtime but something closer to an audience. Petitioners are quietly ushered in, one at a time, to kneel at the foot of the bed. They present papers, bow low, and receive the king's judgment. The entire ceremony is both intimate and grand, with Henry presiding like a monarch in miniature court. Mainstream historical accounts confirm that the royal bedchamber was a place of immense political influence. Gentlemen of the privy chamber were chosen because they could approach the king when no one else could, bringing news, letters, or urgent matters of state. Decisions that seemed to appear fully formed in the council chamber often had their roots in conversations held here, with Henry propped up against cushions. You notice that tonight Henry is in a good mood. He signs a warrant with a flourish, chuckles at a jest, and waves a man forward for a private word. The atmosphere shifts with every smile, every frown, every tilt of the king's head. It is dizzying to realize how much of England's fate is being decided from a mattress draped in gold-threaded linen. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind. During the reign of Louis XIV of France, the lever and coucher rising and going to bed ceremonies became formalized court events. with nobles competing for the honor of handing the king his slippers. Henry's court was less rigid, but no less symbolic. To be present at Henry's bedside was to be marked as part of the inner circle. You imagine jealous rivals outside the locked door, straining to hear any scrap of what is being said inside, knowing that their exclusion might cost them power. Historians still argue whether this transformation of the bed into a stage for governance was intentional or simply evolved over time. Did Henry deliberately cultivate the image of himself as a king who ruled even from his pillows? Or was it merely necessity, his health forcing him to hold audiences where he was most comfortable? Tonight, watching the careful choreography of courtiers kneeling and rising, you suspect there was intent. Henry was a master of image, and nothing about this setting is accidental. The bed's symbolism goes beyond politics. You notice how richly it is adorned, how its hangings bear not just Tudor roses but also religious motifs. This is not merely furniture, it is propaganda. Anyone entering the room would be reminded of Henry's authority as head of the Church of England, his power both temporal and spiritual. Even in nightclothes, he radiates kingship. A servant brings forward a casket containing the royal signet, and Henry uses it to seal a letter. The wax glows red in the firelight, and you feel a shiver as you realize that this decision, made here, will carry the force of law across the realm. The bedchamber is both sanctuary and engine room, its quiet night work shaping the world beyond its walls. One whimsical story makes you smile. It is said that Henry once received a French envoy while still in bed, insisting that this display of casual dominance would show the ambassador who truly held power. You can almost picture the scene, the envoy bowing low, while Henry, enormous and commanding even in a nightshirt, loomed above him like a mountain. The audience ends, and the room gradually clears until only the trusted few remain. The curtains are drawn, but they do not shut out the sense of majesty that lingers. Even with the candles snuffed and the chamber settling into quiet, you can feel the way this bed radiates authority. It is as though the mattress itself has absorbed years of decisions, arguments, blessings, and curses. You lie down on your pallet, staring at the carved canopy overhead. It strikes you that in this world, the boundaries between public and private are nearly non-existent. The throne room may be where Henry displays his crown, but the bed is where he displays his control, subtler, quieter, but perhaps even more potent. The fire burns low, throwing long shadows that seem to stretch like fingers across the floor. Somewhere beyond the walls, the castle sleeps, but this room never entirely stops ruling. You close your eyes with the realization that you are not just a witness to a king's bedtime routine, you are watching the heartbeat of the Tudor monarchy, pulsing steadily even under a coverlet. Tonight, the chamber feels as though it is holding its breath. The fire burns low, and every shadow seems to lean toward the royal bed. You sense that you are nearing the final act of a long and exhausting drama. Henry VIII is no longer the athletic prince who dazzled Europe. He is an aging, ailing monarch, and everyone in the room knows that the end is approaching. The bedchamber has transformed into a place of vigil, where each night could be the last. You notice immediately that there are more candles than usual. Their flames dance along the carved posts of the bed, throwing a golden light over Henry's face. He looks older than you have ever seen him, the lines etched deep, his beard more white than red. His massive body lies propped up by pillows, as though even lying flat has become too difficult. The attendants stand close, their faces grave, and you realize this is no ordinary bedtime ritual. This is a death watch. The groom of the stool hovers near the bed, ready to catch the king's words if he speaks. The physicians are here too, their instruments laid out, a basin of water and cloths ready. You feel the air thicken with expectation. If Henry should slip away tonight, these will be the witnesses who can testify to his final moments, who can confirm that he died a king and not in disgrace. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. When Henry's last illness worsened in January 1547, the court was gripped with fear. No one dared speak of his death openly. Doing so could be considered treason, but preparations were quietly made. Sir Anthony Denny, the most trusted of Henry's bedchamber attendants, was the one chosen to break the news to the king that he was dying. Tonight, you can almost feel that moment hovering in the air, unspoken but inevitable. Henry stirs and asks for wine. A servant rushes forward, tastes it first, and then offers it to him. The king sips slowly, then leans back, closing his eyes. The room is utterly silent, except for the occasional pop of the fire. You find yourself staring at the flickering candles, imagining how they must look to Henry like small wavering souls waiting to be extinguished. A quirky tidbit adds an almost eerie touch. Some chroniclers claim that courtiers feared being absent at the moment of the king's death, lest they be accused of negligence or even treason. Being in the room when Henry breathed his last was both an honor and a potential death sentence. Too much eagerness could be seen as hoping for the king's end. Too little attendance could be seen as abandoning him. You can feel that tension now. Each man stands as still as stone, careful not to draw attention, but unwilling to step away. Historians still debate exactly what Henry's final words were, or if he spoke at all. Some accounts suggest that when asked if he wished to see a priest, he simply nodded. Others insist that he murmured a few words of confession before slipping into unconsciousness. The details are hazy, but what is certain is that this chamber became the stage for his last performance as king, with courtiers straining to read meaning into every twitch of his fingers, every flutter of his eyelids. The night stretches on, and you begin to understand how exhausting a death watch can be. Time seems to move more slowly, every sound amplified. The rustle of the sheets, the creak of a stool as someone shifts, the faint scratching of a quill as an attendant notes the hour. You find yourself staring at the fire until your eyes water, almost hypnotized. Henry breathes heavily, each rise and fall of his chest watched like an omen. The physicians check his pulse periodically, and each time they step back with grave faces. You realize that you, too, are holding your breath each time they lean over him. When they nod that he still lives, you feel the whole room exhale softly, as though everyone has been granted a brief reprieve. You imagine what it must be like to be one of the king's enemies tonight, waiting in some distant castle, wondering if the news of his death will bring your restoration or your own swift ruin. Even beyond these walls, the kingdom is poised, like a bowstring drawn back, waiting for the moment when the arrow of history will be released. Another curious anecdote floats to you. It is said that after Henry's death, his body was so large that the coffin cracked during transport, and a strange dark fluid seeped out onto the floor of Sion Abbey. Some whispered that this fulfilled a prophecy made years earlier that dogs would lick his blood. Whether true or not, the story haunted people, casting a long, eerie shadow over the memory of his final days. The room grows colder as the night deepens. Someone adds more logs to the fire, and the sparks leap like startled fireflies. The candles burn lower, their light softer, more mournful. Henry stirs once more, opening his eyes, and for a moment you see a flash of the man he once was: fierce, commanding, almost youthful. Then it is gone, and he lies still again. When dawn finally comes, pale light creeping through the shutters, you feel as though you have lived a year in one night. Henry has survived until morning, but everyone knows there will not be many more such mornings. The death watch will continue, night after night, until the inevitable arrives. You stretch your aching limbs and look once more at the royal bed. It no longer feels like merely a piece of furniture but like a shrine, a place where history is pausing to take a long, solemn breath. And you realize that when Henry finally does leave this room for the last time, it will be the end of an age not just for the court but for all of England. The night you enter the chamber again, there is no mistaking the gravity in the air. Everything feels suspended, as if the castle itself is waiting for the end. The bed is surrounded by flickering candles, more than usual, their light making the tapestries ripple as though alive. Henry VIII lies in the center, no longer the vigorous monarch who once bestrode the tiltyard, but a shadow of the man he had been. His breathing is shallow, each rise and fall of his chest measured by every eye in the room. This is the night when the king will finally surrender his body to history. The attendants are quieter than you have ever seen them. The groom of the stool, Anthony Denny, kneels near the bed, whispering softly to the king. You catch a few words: "Prepare your soul," and you know that the message has been delivered. The king is dying. There is a solemn dignity in Henry's response. He nods faintly, his face set, and murmurs that he wishes to confess. The priests are brought in quickly, their black robes rustling like wind through a graveyard. They kneel, administer the rites, and intone prayers that echo softly against the stone walls. Mainstream historical accounts tell us that Henry received the sacrament of extreme unction on his deathbed, a final reconciliation after years of turbulent religious change. He had broken with Rome, made himself head of the Church of England, dissolved the monasteries, and remade the spiritual life of his nation. And now, at the last, He lies under a canopy adorned with the Tudor rose and the royal crown, seeking peace for his soul. The room smells of beeswax and incense, a heavy, holy scent that clings to your clothes and hair. The fire burns low, throwing long shadows that seem to sway with the rhythm of Henry's breathing. You watch as he stirs one last time, his eyes opening to look at the attendants gathered around him. Perhaps he sees his friends, his enemies, his wives, Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine, and Catherine passing before him in memory. Perhaps he sees his son Edward, his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, the future of his dynasty. A quirky tidbit surfaces. One courtier later claimed that in his final hours, Henry asked for music to be played softly near the bed. Whether true or not, you imagine a quiet lute melody filling the room, the notes trembling like candle flames. It would be a fitting end for a man who loved pageantry and performance, a final sound to usher him into whatever lay beyond. Historians still argue about Henry's last moments. Did he speak? Did he confess fully? Did he die in terror or in peace? The chroniclers disagree, and perhaps they always will. But tonight, standing here, you feel the stillness deepen. The murmured prayers cease, and the room shift into a silence so profound it feels like the entire kingdom is listening. Henry exhales one last time, and the sound is followed by a strange, heavy quiet. A priest closes his eyes. The groom of the stool bows his head. And then, like a ripple spreading outward, everyone in the room lowers themselves, acknowledging that the King of England has gone. The chamber suddenly becomes both holy place and political theater. Messengers hurry to seal the doors and control the news. A council is summoned in secret to plan the transition to Edward's reign, but for a few moments, no one moves. You find yourself staring at the bed, which now seems to glow in the candlelight, as if it has absorbed the king's final breath. And then the transformation begins. The bed is stripped, the body prepared, the chamber purified. Courtiers who were silent moments ago begin whispering, calculating their positions under the new regime. The politics of succession have begun even before Henry's body is cold. You step back, letting the others work, and look around one last time. This room has been a theater of life, of politics, of marriage, of war councils, of punishments and reconciliations. And now it has become a tomb. You can almost hear the echoes of all those who stood here before you, queens, courtiers, servants watching, waiting, fearing, hoping. At last, you turn toward the door, the key clicking softly as it unlocks. The bedchamber will soon be open to a different world, a new reign, a new chapter in England's story. But tonight, in this quiet moment, you feel the weight of finality settle over everything. The man who once made England tremble lies still, and with him an age has ended. You take one last look at the bed before stepping out into the cold corridor beyond. The candles burn on, steady and unblinking, keeping watch over a king who will never wake again. Word count, 2,101. The chamber falls silent in your memory now, and the images begin to soften, as though you are slowly blowing out the last candles one by one. The weight of history eases as you step back from the bed and let the heavy curtains fall. The fire burns lower, and the rushes on the floor no longer crunch beneath your feet. They simply rest, like the castle itself, waiting for a new morning. You picture Henry's chamber empty, the windows open to let in fresh air, the bed stripped of its splendor, no longer a throne but just a piece of furniture. You breathe more slowly, letting the tension drain away from your shoulders. The echoes of royal laughter, anger, and judgment fade until they are little more than distant murmurs. Even the smell of incense and tallow candles seems to lift from the room, leaving only the clean scent of night air. Outside, you imagine the first birds beginning to sing, announcing dawn. The court will soon awaken to a world without Henry, but for now you are safe in this quiet moment, your pulse steady, your mind calm. The long vigil is over, and you are free to rest. So close your eyes, let the flicker of candlelight fade from your mind's eye, and feel the castle grow still around you. The king sleeps his final sleep. The past has settled into its place, and the night belongs only to you.